William Hogeland writes about early American history as it reflects on this day and age, so I shudder to think of what he is working on now. But he is the author of Declaration, The Whiskey Rebellion, Founding Finance, and most recently, Autumn of the Black Snake, which is an exploration of both the physical and the political battles that led to the creation of the United States' first standing army. There's this moment early in the book where he's introducing the Native American war leaders Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, which I think is a good explanation or a good way to demonstrate the way that William Hogeland writes history overall, which is that he begins a paragraph, "You had to be there." This is a paragraph that's happening in like 1791, I think. But that's clearly his goal. He writes intricate, vivid history, makes you feel like you're there. It's a delight to read and I think to listen to. So please join me to welcome William Hogeland to Politics and Prose.
Thanks. Hello. Hello. Yes. All right. People say hello. Thanks for that great introduction too. That was very, very gratifying. So yeah, I have been writing about the early republic, the early American republic, from a point of view that's a little unusual in that I'm writing largely about resistance to the founding of the early republic from various angles. Resistance to the founding as the founders finally did establish the nation. So I've written about the Whiskey Rebellion, in which people objected to Hamiltonian finance, that very important part of the founding, and I've written about some of the politics behind the Declaration of Independence, where an alliance was formed between some of the famous founders and some people no one's ever heard of, and in the end, the ones we've never heard of, who had a populist egalitarian approach, really didn't end up participating. And then I've got this sort of, if you think of it as a trilogy, this would be kind of the climax of that trilogy, because this is a big resistance, a literal military, physical resistance to the attempt, and finally the successful attempt of the founding of George Washington's administration and the founding generation to conquer what is now the Midwest of the United States, and that happened via conquest, as I'm saying. So this was a major conflict, a major fight. People say, "What's the book about?" I'm always sort of like, well, it's about the first war this nation ever fought. And there's kind of a pause, because actually what's really weird is when I first came across this, I'm like, wait, what? What is this? You know, you would think about the Revolution. Well, that's before there was actually a nation. Well, then we think about the War of 1812, and it's all sort of, then we're off to the Civil War. The first war this nation ever fought was the war I'm writing about in this book. And it wasn't just the first war, it's the context in which the Army, the United States Army, and ultimately the United States military establishment was formed. So it's before that, there really was no U.S. Army. There really was no formal, nationally organized professional army. And in the context of this war, that entity came into being. And of course, we look around today, we have an army, putting it fairly mildly. In fact, we have a whole military establishment. It's the beginning of that thing that became globally important, incredibly important. And it's the conquest, as I just said, of what became the Midwest, which of course very shortly after this conquest, surprisingly shortly afterward, became the great industrial driver of American economic power. So people say, "What's your book about?" I'm kind of like, oh, nothing much, just like the most important thing that ever happened. That's kind of like, but whatever, you don't have to hear about it. It's like, every author thinks that what their book's about is the most important thing that ever happened. Otherwise, you wouldn't really be wanting to spend all this time writing about it. So every book has one thesis, which is this: I'm writing about the thing you need to read about, so buy my book. That's thesis number one. And then some books have two theses, that one and the attempt to sort of develop the idea and sort of at least try to show why this thing might, if it's not the most important thing that ever literally happened, why it's important enough to be kind of trying to get people's attention on it. Because this war is so little known, I might be overcorrecting a little bit, of course, trying to just get people's attention. Like sometimes you have to kind of get out the 2x4 and start waving it around just to get people to notice what you're doing. But I think, you're not going to be able to get this from me tonight, but I think if you were to read the book, you would at least be able to assess, the question of whether I'm able to show that this This has surprising importance to the formation of the nation, and then surprising importance to then what became the future of the nation. And I think it has importance to the current and the future politics and life of the nation at a time when, of course, we're all really thinking a lot about that. So I'm going to start off by reading, actually, before I get into any more detail about what it's about. I'm going to read an excerpt from the prologue and an excerpt from the first chapter. They're both actually really short anyway, and I'm going to shorten them for this purpose. And you'll see that it's so, because I'm basically what these opening words do is sort of try to invite the reader, and here I'm going to sort of sketchily kind of try to invite you into this strange journey, because it's a thing we don't know about. You know, it takes a little like walking up to, and it starts, you'll see, in a somewhat surprising place, given that I'm talking really in the end about the 1790s. So the prologue is called "The Ruins of an Old French Fort." Where the Mississippi River drains North America on the southward tilt, ceaselessly carving and enriching the bottomland, France once gave a name to an expanse fanning asymmetrically eastward and westward from that spine of moving sediment. Saying its name in rude mimicry of Cajun, Quebecois, or the Paris street, like a guttural "un roi," would parody how a new Frenchman might have pronounced what his trading partners designated savage called that expanse. Of Europeans, it was traders, soldiers, villagers, and administrators of France who first came to know the Illinois country. They knew it for a long time. But unlike the English speakers who came later, the French never knew that region as an American West. They did go west. Early on, they navigated Lake Superior before they even knew about Lake Erie. They would name the Platte and ascend the Missouri. French traders would lift their eyes to the white peaks of the Rockies, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing, once it was sorted out and made feasible, was to travel up the St. Lawrence River from the Citadel, Quebec, into Lake Ontario, portage around the gigantic falls of the Niagara River into Lake Erie, embark upon rivers running down to wider rivers, cross more of the land bridges known as portages, and finally enter the Mississippi itself as it moved so treacherously but steadily lower to posts below sea level at New Orleans and Biloxi, and emerge at last in the Gulf of Mexico. This empire wasn't western but transmarine. It stretched from the St. Lawrence's mouth at the Atlantic to the Mississippi's mouth at the Gulf. And the question sort of lurks around, why? Why? Why do you have an empire? What are you doing here? Here's the answer. Like other people, Europeans had to wear hats. There was no imaginable alternative to covering the head, and a hat had become the standard means, so demand was ceaseless. Smooth, warm fur of the big beaver made the best felt for peltry hats, as well as for other garments. And the beaver had grown scarce in Europe, with a market nevertheless unsaturated, thanks to price. Discovering the outlandish abundance of giant beavers in North America had been like discovering gold and silver, or a license to coin them. The supply was evidently inexhaustible, and obtaining it was easy. By the mid-17th century, a host of indigenous cultures, expert in extracting the resource, had become eager for, dependent on, everything that Europe made in such high volume: metal, buttons, muskets, glass, tailoring, brandy, and more. And forts. It was in service of getting beaver and other furs that the French became such great woodland fort builders. Illinois country Indians often sought protection from the powerful, aggressive Iroquois Confederation to the east, and the French built forts, usually with the permission of their trading partners, on the high banks of the Mississippi itself. Others they garrisoned near strategic confluences of the many tributaries. A few permanent settlers hugged the network in support, and the villages were nice, with houses standing gaily painted in rows along the riverbanks. While English speakers to the east thought of the region as remote, the more cosmopolitan forts were scenes of balls and soirées. Villagers owned mirrors, billiard tables, and neat kitchen gardens. Many years later, American soldiers discovering the ruins of an old fort on the Great Miami River in the former Illinois country would conclude that no Indian nation could have enjoyed sole hegemony there. The French had been there too. New France villagers wore the latest Paris fashions. So they wore, of course, the American beaver. Of peltry from America, the hatters of France made thousands and thousands of hats, and French merchants and shippers sold some of them across the sea to the French Americans. That all went on for nearly 100 years. And that, that, boys and girls, is called mercantilism, or an oddball riff on mercantilism, however you want to look at it. When you turn the page, I really like the way the designers and the publishers set this up. Before you get to chapter 1, you get a map, which you will definitely need to read this book. You'll get a map. I always think this is like when the title sequence in a premium cable show. You get the teaser, which is what I just read part of to you, and then you get the theme song comes up, and this would move around, and you'd see images, and it would be super cool. And now, part 1, Sinclair's Retreat, chapter 1, the death of General Butler, and again, I'm going to excerpt this chapter. You won't get it all. On a November morning in 1791, nearly 30 years after the French crown abandoned its American empire, a man named Richard Butler sat against a mattress, propped against the base of an oak, dying in pain near a bend of the Upper Wabash River. Butler came from Pennsylvania, and to him, this cold ground, once called the Illinois country, lay indisputably in the American West, specifically in the Northwest Territory of the United States. Close by and in the distance, others were dying too, hundreds of them. Some screamed and some groaned, and through the smoke of exploded gunpowder came a deafening cacophony of musket and rifle fire, triumphant screams of the enemy, and orders yelled in English and being ignored. Around the wounded Butler, a group of men and officers crouched in hurried conference. Butler started laughing. Evidently, he'd registered the shrieks of a cadet nearby and was struck by the sheer intensity of the noise. He was a heavy man, and as he laughed, his sides shook his coat. Some of the men around him were grieved to think he had no chance. Others thought he might make it if they could only remove him from the scene, but it was becoming horribly clear that getting out of here at all, let alone lugging a large man, was more unlikely every second. Most of the officers were dead. The numb-fingered soldiers, left alive, had been firing as best they could, but as the enemy began to breach the perimeter, they gave up, collapsed their formations, and crowded by terrified instinct toward the center of the field of battle. There they were easy to shoot down en masse. Now where Richard Butler sat propped, his youngest brother, Captain Edward Butler, appeared, carrying on his back another brother, Colonel Thomas Butler, both legs broken. In pain and with no time to spare, arrows were thrumming into the row of tents. The Butler brothers tried to confer. And I'll skip over so you don't find out about what happens to the Butler brothers. You'll have to actually read the book to find out about that. Let's move to another part of this battle, another part of the forest, as Shakespeare would put it. And let's meet some other characters. Somewhere in the smoke and chill of that November morning were Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. Little Turtle would be leading Miami forces, Blue Jacket the Shawnee, and both were leading the whole thing. The scene, so horrific and chaotic for American soldiers, was for the Indians becoming a thrilling victory, thanks to precise planning, irreproachable execution, and full coordination of forces led mainly by those two men along with the Delaware war leader, Buckongahelas. Little Turtle and Blue Jacket never agreed on much. Those who talked about them at the time and would write about them in the future, some praising Blue Jacket to the detriment of Little Turtle, others vice versa, never agreed either. But that November morning, as a man they'd come to see as their nemesis sat dying under an oak, they were in agreement on at least one thing. This was a war for the survival of their people, and they would work together to win it. The victory they were even now achieving against U.S. forces represented a triumphant step forward in that war for survival. It was English speakers, of course, who called the Miami leader Little Turtle, sometimes the Little Turtle, sometimes only Turtle. In his language, he was called something English speakers phonetically approximated as Michiquiniqua, referring to the common painted turtle of North America. Blue Jacket's name had once been something sounding like Sepetecanate, which comes into this language as the Big Rabbit. But he changed it to something that might be translated as Whirlpool. And the handle Blue Jacket had nothing to do with either of his other names. There was a reason for it, but nobody remembered what it was. You had to be there. Today, the Indians had encircled the Americans' camp in a crescent, with Blue Jackets, Little Turtles, and Buckongahelas' men making up the crescent's base, and fighters from other nations on each horn. Then the crescent moved, synchronized. The leader's base charged the camp's center, while the horns, not charging, ran all the way around the outside of the camp's perimeter. Caught in that net, the Americans never had a chance. That's what the men whom English speakers called Blue Jacket and Little Turtle were good at. It took collaboration. What that is the, I was almost going to say the famous defeat of Arthur Sinclair at the Upper Wabash in 1791, except it's not famous. It was a gigantic victory for the indigenous forces led by the people I've just been talking about, and a horrifying defeat for the Americans. It started something huge that has gone on, and yet that battle doesn't really have much of a name, and the war I'm talking about doesn't even have a name either. Just to give you a general sense, Sinclair led about 1,500 officers and men plus dozens of others, soldiers. They used to actually bring a lot of other people with them on these kind of incredibly cumbersome expeditions. Soldiers, wives, girlfriends, and children, wagon and pack horse drivers, to a bivouac on the bend of the Upper Wabash, failed to fortify his encampment. In the ensuing battle, about 650 American troops died, including nearly all of the officers, along with 50 civilians, including nearly all of the women and children. Some claim the total of the dead was more like 900, plus about 300 horribly wounded. Nearly a third of the nation's troops, that is, were killed in a few hours. And the survivors took away unforgettable horror at the torture and mutilation to which the dying were exuberantly and ritually subjected, which I will skip over here. So that's that battle. That's the beginning of the book. That's the inciting incident for the story I'm telling. Why am I telling this story? Here's my thesis. Here's what in magazine writing they call the nut graph, except it's actually two short graphs. A fundamental shift was about to begin in North American life, with the losers' outrage and terror deepening in response to Sinclair's awful defeat on the Wabash. And with the winners' excitement over their great victory mounting, a war would begin. The existence, purpose, and future of the United States of America was formed in that war, and yet it would be forgotten. The first war the United States ever fought, in which the U.S. Army itself came into being, would never even be given a name. And so with a major giant claim like that, the natural question that I've been fielding as I've been working on this book is this. So this all took place in present day where? And that's a natural question, given that it's sort of there's the map here, but the map doesn't have state lines drawn on it in where I'm talking about because there were no states there yet. So it's a mysterious area in a way. If you take that trip back with me into the past, it's like we're going into a different country, or it's almost like the history of a different country, except it's our country. And I will conclude this with this final paragraph of the first chapter. This all took place in present day where? You can walk a pleasant, quiet main street in what is now western Ohio to a plaque marking the site of Richard Butler's death, but that's the wrong answer. You can get the address in seconds. It won't help. Butler died in a deep woods, the trees widely spaced and so big around that it would take many men to circle some of them. It was late fall, the branches probably not yet completely bare, so if the smoke hadn't been so thick, some sky might have been visible, but you'd have to tilt your head back to see it. And in summer, that place was dim, full of bird song and the sound of wind in leaves, the branches creaking far overhead. But it's not just the shorn land and artificially exposed sky that make it impossible for us to go where this story took place. It's not even the astonishing rarity of descendants of the people who had lived there for so long. The story of the only indigenous alliance to win battles that might have defeated American expansion into the West, and the story of the founding of the U.S. Army, with all of its world historical future coded in embryo, in the first war that the United States ever fought, the story, that is, of Americans' real emergence as a national people, is set in regions we don't recognize, map to our world, or have any bearings in. So that's the kind of the invocation to the muse or whatever. Let's try and take this trip. And of course, here's the thing, we're not going to take this trip here this evening. We're going to talk for another few minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions and comments. So instead of trying to give you the whole deal on what everything that happened in this book, which would be impossible, I'm just going to name off a few things that we might bounce off of. In terms of discussing this. I mean, one of the things that always comes to my mind, it keeps coming to mind, is why don't we know about this? And that remains kind of a bigger and more mysterious question that we could entertain together. This war that starts here took place between 1791 and 1795, basically. It does involve, even though I just said there are no ways to get your bearings, it does involve famous people we know about. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, everybody's new best friend now. He's in it. And what we find them doing is engaging in politics on a day-to-day basis in Washington's cabinet, right? Washington, Henry Knox, the Secretary at War, Hamilton, and Jefferson. And what's kind of cool about that, if you like politics, is that they were busy trying, after this defeat of Sinclair, they were trying to get an army bill, a real army, a standing army, a professional American army, through Congress. And there was huge resistance to that. Many, many members of Congress and many American people did not want a standing professional army. It was considered potentially a tool of monarchy. It was not something that a lot of people thought, like, republics shouldn't have that. So the political fight between the executive branch and the representative branch over that issue, and the success of the executive branch is one of the key stories here. And you will see Jefferson and Hamilton, for example. You know, we're always talking about Jefferson and Hamilton and the sort of two divergent visions of America and all that, all of which is true. But you would get the feeling that they would be sitting around in Washington's cabinet kind of thinking big thoughts about the future of America. You know, I mean, what they did in the cabinet every day was work. You know, they showed up for work every day, and they did jobs. And if they hadn't, you know, nothing would have happened. Nothing. They didn't sit around. We focus on their writings of, you know, Hamilton, the Federalist, and many of Jefferson's great works and his letters and so forth, philosophical thinking. But they worked, and the other thing is they worked together in the cabinet. I mean, they hated each other. And they undermined each other, but they worked together under Washington's aegis to get this bill passed, and they did it with great toughness, hardball politics, political adroitness to overcome the enormous resistance in the Congress to passing this bill. And they did it by putting the Congress in a position where it was very hard for some of these congressmen to fight back, because it was going to look, if something else happened and they hadn't passed the Army bill, how were they going to look? But getting that clear to the congressmen and getting that first through the House, and then to get it through the Senate, Washington had to privately and personally make deals with certain senators. And this is what they did all day. They didn't just sit around thinking big thoughts. They worked, and they had incredible success here, although it ends up being fairly fraught also, because they're launching an invasion of Indian country. So there's that. You'll see that. And in fact, you'll see you'll see the first investigation by Congress of the presidency. First actual official congressional investigation of the executive branch happens here in response to Sinclair's defeat. And in fact, the first invocation of executive privilege as a concept happens here as well. You know, so it all happens here. See, that's what I'm saying. So they bring in, you know, the cabinet meets and they say to Washington, you know, the Congress wants these papers, you know, do we just hand them over? And I don't know, this has never happened before, literally never happened before. They have to sit down and think about it. And all of his cabinet advised him, well, you can hand over papers, but, you know, at your own discretion, not because you have to. You know, you do it because you want to, not because they tell you to, kind of thing. And that begins there, and has that ever been fully resolved to anyone's perfect satisfaction? I don't think so. So there's that. Now the territory that what they're doing is they're getting an army bill passed so they can make this invasion of this territory. What is this territory? I've called it the modern Midwest, and I mean it's Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, with, you know, actually everything from the Ohio River to the Mississippi and up to the Great Lakes. That territory has a backstory too that is not well understood, which is that George Washington was only one person, but he was the most important person, who had his eye on that territory from the time he was like 17. This wasn't like, now we've won the revolution, what should we do? Anyone have any ideas for something we could do? Let's go take that territory. No, they'd been trying to take that territory since the 1750s. A cause of war, a cause of the revolution, a cause of fighting for American independence was British restriction of American efforts to make a major real estate play for all of that incredibly rich land. That's what they wanted. And the British were trying to maintain the fur trade, so they drew a line. The King of England drew a line across the crest of the Appalachians and said no further white settlement this way, which was robbing all these American investors, Washington, Jefferson, others, Patrick Henry, of the bets they were placing, the financial bets they were placing. So that territory has a long, deep backstory, which you will also get as backstory in this book, especially in how it affects Washington's thinking and Jefferson's thinking. Hamilton, too, of course, didn't have long-standing investments there because he wasn't around, and he wasn't really that kind of person. He came from a different background. Still, Hamilton was unabashed about saying, you know, there's no United States without that. You know, it's not just a cause of revolution, it was a cause partly of forming the nation itself, to make a more efficient, organized, concentrated way of administering the Northwest Territory. Only problem being, other people lived there other people had entire complicated, detailed politics of their own there going on at the same time. And this real estate thing is a critically important theme in here. We talk about Western settlement. We're always imagining some guy, you know, sod busting with no one else around, just, you know, independent families just trying to make it on the soil. Those people existed, but the bigger picture is there were millions of acres chartered by the government to giant land companies. There was a huge amount of money to be made in having public-private partnerships around settlement, which frequently meant well-connected, government-connected rich people buying millions of acres of land and having those grants chartered by government. And then, yes, they would sell it, rent it, and so forth to other people. So, I mean, the Times had a story the other day which had a paragraph beginning something like, as our first real estate developer president, comma, Trump faces, and, you know, I don't know how many real estate developer presidents we've had, but the first president of the United States was a real estate developer by profession. That's literally what that's what his job was. So what we're getting is a combination here of massive investment interests combined with military power to secure a region which had vast value and in which other people lived. I'm going to kind of conclude this sort of fast list that I'm giving you of what's in the book by not forgetting to talk for a minute more about Little Turtle and Blue Jacket in particular. I've noticed something when I've been doing some interviews about this book, and it's natural, and I blame myself, not the interviewers. Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, these people are well known, and it's interesting to look at them in this light, and that's so interesting that even as I'm saying, oh, no one really knows about this, we keep forgetting it, there's some kind of cultural amnesia here, we still, even while we're talking about it, pass over the other side of the story. I've tried hard in the book to keep a kind of an image of balance there. But when we're talking about it, it's just easier to talk about the more famous people. And Little Turtle and Blue Jacket are not household names, even among those who really care about these issues, about the whole idea of the Western Indian Wars and so forth. I mean, Sitting Bull's a household name, Crazy Horse is a household name. To get a little defensive on behalf of Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, I'm going to say why. When they had the biggest, that defeat I was just reading you about, that victory I was just reading to you about, that was the biggest victory of indigenous people against U.S. troops ever in history. There's never been anything to touch it since then. The Little Bighorn was nothing compared to that. I mean in absolute numbers. A guy told me Peter Cousins, who's written about the Western Indian Wars, the Plains Wars, told me yesterday that, and I didn't even know this exact statistic, like if 900 people died there, 900 U.S. troops died there, that's about the same number as died in the next multiple decades of the Plains Indian Wars. They died that morning. So, you know, how important is this? It's pretty important. So I wonder why we know Sitting Bull's name, you know, and not Little Turtles and Blue Jackets. And their relationship was so fraught, which again, I'm not going to go into now. You can read about it, but they had such differing personalities, and yet they were so complementary at times. And then as things changed, and as always happens with alliances, you know, they began to actually achieve something. Now the differences between them began to set them at odds with one another. And it's it ends up being a pretty tragic story, actually, because they had a lot going for them, each in his own way. And so that's in there. And I don't think they're ever going to necessarily be household names. There's something going on here, or we just want to remember the ones who didn't win as effectively as these guys did. I'm pointing out, here are their names. I'm looking at them. Tecumseh. Everybody knows about Tecumseh. I mean, not everybody knows about Tecumseh, but it's a name. People have heard the name Tecumseh. Tecumseh never won a battle against the United States. Why is Tecumseh so famous? I throw that out there. And finally, another person who was once very famous in America and is no longer so famous is General Wayne, Anthony Wayne, Mad Anthony, who actually came back from the Sinclair defeat, built the U.S. Army. When Washington hired him, appointed him to command the new army that he was going to have to build from scratch, this was considered an insane idea. Anthony Wayne had pretty successful revolutionary career as an officer, but he had gone into debt and just made horrible decisions. He was being investigated and finally thrown out of Congress for election fraud. This was not a confidence-inspiring move to hire Mad Anthony as the general. And yet, he was unbelievable. I mean, he was mad for discipline. He actually Sinclair just never fortified his encampment. Wayne fortified and fortified and fortified and never looked up. And then the name Black Snake, this is Autumn of the Black Snake, his enemy, the indigenous people he was marching against, gave him that nickname in grudging admiration for his, they saw the black snake, the actual black snake of nature, as an animal that didn't sleep. And so they called him the Black Snake because, as Little Turtle said, he doesn't sleep. Little Turtle was a genius at raiding supply and robbing the U.S. troops of their supply and stopping them that way. They couldn't steal horses, they couldn't steal food, and that's when Little Turtle began to see the potential for loss, that it wasn't going to be another Sinclair, victory over another Sinclair, that there was going to be a problem. And that's when he and Blue Jacket came at odds with each other, because Blue Jacket kept believing that they were going to win. So Anthony Wayne, again, not somebody, we talk about the founders, but really the Midwest is there because of Anthony Wayne, you could say. He went farther than Washington ever went physically, geographically, and he did what Washington needed to have done. And he had an irascible and very difficult and interesting personality, but he was, really the first great American general. And if you think about some of the things he did, he did stuff that, that can remind you of Patton at times or of MacArthur. He was a problematic personality, but without him, no Patton, no Pershing, no Lee and Grant. Why don't we talk about Anthony Wayne? And I think one reason is, and I'll kind of close with this thought, and this is what makes it, I think it's a fun story, but I also think it's an unsettling and displacing story. Wayne used to be really well known and well admired, and there are towns called Wayne everywhere he went, from Pennsylvania to Georgia and South Carolina to all over parts of the Midwest. And statues of him too. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, for example, there's a big statue of him in a park there. He was well known for a long time. Theodore Roosevelt thought of Wayne as just this really important general. But the reason Roosevelt thought of Wayne as a crucially important general, and Roosevelt made no bones about this, he was unabashed and unashamed of saying things like this. He saw Wayne as really having been the one who shifted the great wealth of a continent from what Roosevelt saw as an inferior race to what Roosevelt saw as a superior race. So it's hard to talk about. So if you're going to reject that way of looking at Wayne and what he did, or if you're going to try and push back against that, you end up with a bit of a problem. And I think one of the things we've done is just forget about Wayne instead of actually coming back with anything on that, or accepting that he existed and seeing how we feel about it. The glorification of Wayne was so imperialist, so straight up racist, so overbearing by somebody like Teddy Roosevelt that we can't really, it's hard to have that argument. But John Wayne he wasn't born John Wayne. He named himself John Wayne after Anthony Wayne. So there was a time when Wayne was really considered a great man. And I'm not trying to bring back the idea of Wayne as a great man. I'm trying to say these are the stories that, without some imaginative, emotional connection to these stories, we're really missing a large part of who we are and how we got here, as painful as they may be. And even though they're painful, I think there can be an excitement, too, to rediscovering these things, especially when you have characters like Little Turtle and Blue Jacket and Wayne and differing views of Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Knox, and so forth. So that's kind of some of the stuff that's going on in this book. And with that, I'm going to conclude my just talking part of this talk. And maybe we can move to a Q&A. Or thank you. Or a discussion of some kind, and you can bring up ideas that you're thinking about. You are going to have to use the microphone, and you already are.
Yes.
Perfect.
So you said that people got grants of land west of the Appalachians in these areas. Who gave out the grants? Was it the American government? Was it the British government? Did the British, when they withdrew, their line withdrew also? And
That's the controversial question, right? I mean, at first the British government gave grants, yes, but the British government was stingy with the grants because they wanted to maintain the fur trade and not upset their native partners. Once the British had withdrawn, first the Continental Congress gave those grants, and then the U.S. Congress, which superseded the Continental Congress, gave those grants. The question about whether the line remained or not is exactly what they were fighting about. The indigenous people said, okay, there used to be a line drawn at the crest of the Appalachians. You know, the British drew it. We signed treaties for that. What are you doing? And then they actually agreed before the Revolution, okay, it's hard to enforce a line at the top of the mountains. Let's move it to the Ohio River, which was a huge concession. The people who lived there made this massive concession. And then as soon as the United States won the War of Independence, they told those same people who felt that they had treaties on these issues, it's not going to work to make it the Ohio River anymore. We're going to have to move you further back. And so this idea of constantly pushing the native people into smaller and smaller spaces begins there. And Little Turtle and Blue Jacket said, no, you know, it's the Ohio River. We've already made a massive concession. It's the Ohio River or bust, basically, and that's where the war came from.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi,
2 microphones.
my name's John Hawley, and I'm so happy to meet a historian who understands the centrality of Western Pennsylvania to the fate of our nation. My
I
mother
do
and father were
understand
both
that.
born in Newcastle, PA, so
Cool, yes.
they need all the good press they can get.
I've focused on that area a lot in my work.
So I have 2 questions for you. I've read about a third of your book. I'm very engrossed in it. First of all, I wonder if you propose a name for this war, like Wayne's War or something like that.
War,
Okay.
like Wayne's World.
And then the other question I have is, you have a couple of paragraphs where you talk about this 20 years before the American Revolution, and you kind of throw up your hands and you say, this is so complicated, there's so much back and forth. No historian really can make any sense out of this at all. And anybody who claims that they can is kind of selling you a load of, and so I'm sort of wondering why that was important for you to put that in there.
Yeah,
What's
yeah.
important about that period?
On the first question, no, I have no name to propose. I really tried, actually, because I thought it might be I could find a title, you know, that way. But I really don't know what to call it. I just think actually trying to name it would be trying to paper over a problem. I don't think I'm going to be the one who's going to finally, you know, make these people household names and give this war a name. I think it's kind of more interesting to kind of dwell on sort of live with the fact that we don't seem to be able to cope with it and see where that goes. On the other question, it's a very granular, and a lot of you haven't read the book, so I won't dwell on it too long. But there is a section where I'm trying to describe ministry policy. It's specifically about the British ministry policies around about what to do about American expansion. And that section you're talking about started out as a note to my editor, because he was very concerned that everything makes sense, which is what an editor really should be doing. And I appreciated that, and in fact, it wouldn't be the book it is if he didn't. But I was trying to tell him, you know, in the end, you keep wanting everything to make sense, but the policy didn't make sense. The British ministry was at odds with itself over everything. And anytime they came up with something, you know, by the time they tried to get the news to their, you know, people on the ground in America, like 50 other things had happened because it was very slow communication in those days. So I started writing him this note, and I realized this just has to go in the book. I mean, I've done the reading. I've tried to understand this stuff. If you try to make it make sense, you'll get away from the fact that it was completely nonsensical. And so I just do this rant. At some point, I just break into this crazy rant about 2 or 3 paragraphs long about just ministry policy. Yeah, so it's an unusual move, and I'm glad you noticed it. Yeah.
You've written and spoken about both the war that can't be named, and the Whiskey Rebellion. Everybody seems to have heard of the Whiskey Rebellion one way or the other. Both of these were roughly the same time.
Yeah, they were, right at the same time.
How were they reported at the time? Did everybody in the country in the 1790s know about the Whiskey Rebellion, and did they all know about this?
Yeah.
Or was this kind of a nothing?
No, it was not obscure at all. That's the other funny thing. It's like this was on the minds of everyone at the time. If you want to sort of project yourself back into the time, you have to know that this is what they were thinking about. I just saw a book over there called, I think, The Indigenous History of the United States, or something like that. I was just leafing through it before I came up here, and it says, truly, you know, the Washington administration and the country was consumed with this issue after Sinclair's defeat. It was like it was a major disaster in American history kind of thing. So it was anything but obscure at the time. The press was full of this stuff. People were screaming and yelling. People out on the frontier were saying, help us, protect us. And people back east were saying, a lot of people back east were opposed to the war. So there was a huge amount of turmoil around it. And that makes it all the stranger that it sort of drops out of our public discourse about the founding.
Okay, thank you.
So I've got a few questions, but I'm going to be doing only one. It's more from like the native perspective of my question, because when I was doing some research from natives' perspectives, native writers have talked about, and you're the historian, please correct me if I'm wrong,
Go.
but after an event, something happened where 80% of our budget was focused on destruction of Indian land and culture. And I was just wondering if this was the event that, correct me if I'm wrong if that's not right, but I've been hearing those reports that 80% of our budget was based on the military. And was this the event that triggered that increased spending in, I don't know how to describe it, but
Yeah, I know what you mean. I
yeah.
can't confirm that number.
Right.
It's true that during this time, though, the military budget skyrocketed. I mean, nobody could have imagined even 3 years before Sinclair's defeat that there would ever be such a budget. 80%, I can't go there exactly, not because I'm saying you're wrong, but because I just don't know.
Okay.
But by the time we get to 1795, and by the time we get to Washington, leaving office, Hamilton's trying to run everything, even though he's also left office, but he's trying to run everything from outside, from outside official power. The Federalist Party started just calling for huge appropriations, and in fact, that was part of what brought the Federalist Party down. I mean, the Republican Party, as it formed itself as a sort of anti-militaristic party, an anti-war party, was starting to call the Federalists militarists because of these over-the-top appropriations. But I can't totally go with your number.
Right.
It may be
Okay.
correct.
Because that's what. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I
just
guess
about
so.
the black snake, because the black
Yeah.
snake it hits me because when I was studying Iroquois history, they talk about an omen, about a black snake omen, that their culture will be destroyed by a black snake. In today's world, they call black snake as the oil pipes in North
Yeah, I
Dakota.
know that. Yeah.
But I was just wondering if the black snake is associated with that omen. That is pretty common in that culture's lore in that part of the country.
That well could be. The people who were calling in the Black Snake were more like the Western Indians, but they had close relationships, which we get into here, with the Iroquois as well, so it could well be. But I did not know that. But it is interesting how the pipeline was also called the Black Snake. Yeah, thanks. Yes.
Was the U.S. victory, ultimate victory in the war, was that inevitable?
Wow, that's like the big question. To the people involved at the time, I would have to say absolutely not. I mean, on all sides of the question, Washington could not possibly have thought victory in this war was inevitable. I mean, I didn't read you the teaser for Chapter 2, but when he heard about the Sinclair defeat, he literally, it's one of the few times he ever physically was seen to completely lose it and have a screaming tantrum meltdown, throwing his arms around, screaming down curses on Sinclair's head. And he told his secretary who saw this that don't ever, this must not leave this room. But of course, that we know about it because that guy talked about it. So no, I don't think Washington. I think Washington was in extraordinary suspense about the outcome, and that's just one side. I don't think it was whether it was inevitable. Is anything? I mean, it absolutely possible that if another Sinclair defeat had occurred, the appetite among the public was weak for this war anyway. So how would your army gets wiped out again? Well, then the army bill is just, for a long time, the army bill would go south. There'd be no way to bring it back. And at that point, I don't know, a lot of things could have happened. I mean, I think they were probably playing what-if games themselves all the time. I mean, I don't know if there would have been, to imagine a sort of a permanent native system out there with British support, maybe from Canada. That's what the British were trying to do. That might have happened, but I think more likely what they feared was that the Spanish would come in. The U.S. would look weak on its western border. And everybody had designs on that. Spain and England, too, still had designs on it. So, no, I don't think the outcome was inevitable, now that I've talked my way through that. But what would have happened is, anybody's guess, of course. Yes.
My dad used to give us kids' books written by military types about the famous Indian chiefs and cavalry leaders and people like that. And the one about the Indian chiefs, the author was an unabashed admirer of Little Turtle as a tactician. Can you
That's
speak to
good
that
to
a little
know.
bit?
Yeah, the Little Turtle I mean, the Little Turtle people like Little Turtle, and they think Blue Jacket was impetuous and had no discipline, and the Blue Jacket people think that Little Turtle was too eager to accommodate the Americans in the end. This is a fight that, since no one's ever heard of these people, it's a fight that goes on among about 6 people who actually know. You know how the smaller the pie, the more vicious the fighting over any, you know. But so that's going on there. Little Turtle's real skills, I think, I looked at it the best I can figure it out. He was really strategically and tactically disciplined in his thinking. He really did have a chance, if he could have kept it going, to make it almost impossible for Wayne's army to move forward, not by trying to attack, tear down the forts, and take casualties, but by actually just really surgically removing supply. This was Wayne's biggest problem. And Wayne started having to use his using cavalry horses just to pull supply trains and assigning, someone's called them super convoys, just to move stuff from point A to point B, because Little Turtle was such a genius at taking that stuff. So I think that's where his real skills lay. And if he had been able to keep that going, it was very difficult to discipline his troops to focus on the objective and not just take casualties, because a lot of glory can be won by taking casualties. He was like, we need to stop doing these adventurous moves and just rob them of supply. And it's true that at some point, the budget would have just become insane, and the American people wouldn't have even been interested. So I think he really tactically was tactically very wise. You can read the book, you can decide if you're a Little Turtle person or a Blue Jacket person, but I really think I think they really did well together. And I don't think Blue Jacket was a terrible tactician, which a lot of Little Turtle fans think.
Don't engage, just keep the supplies as best you could.
Yeah, that was one of his main things. And also in the field, the Sinclair defeat, the two of them were very tactically shrewd, Yes.
Well, thank you for a really interesting story about a fascinating period that I was unaware of. I certainly fit the description of the typical citizen and lack of. So I hesitate to ask you to go a little bit beyond that period, but that's what I want to do, and it's another hypothetical. So maybe you have to talk your way through this one too.
Yeah, probably.
But to what extent did suppose the Army bill had failed, and it took at least a few more years to get a standing army, would the outcome of the War of 1812 perhaps been different?
Right, that's a good question. Again, of course, I don't know, but you raise an interesting point, because the Army bill it passed, but it was close. It was closer. It was more difficult in the Senate than in the House. And I said before, Washington had to cut these deals to swing. I mean, there was a swing vote, basically. And he had to cut that deal to make that happen. So if it hadn't passed, well, I'm just going to stand here silently and try and think that out. I don't know. I mean, by the time the War of 1812 came along, actually a lot of other things had happened that wouldn't have happened either if that Army bill hadn't passed. The Army had become a smaller force by then and had to be rebuilt kind of quickly at the time. So I don't know, but I think, I mean, the main thing this speaks to me is that while the Army after this got bigger and smaller, and before the War of 1812 it was not in very good shape. And there are other times in our history when we've had to do very, very quick and desperate sort of buildups, right? I mean, all the way through, our history.
Right.
Still, the thing that happened here, and if that Army bill hadn't passed, I don't know if it would have happened. But the thing that happened here is its existence that there would be one was never again in doubt. It was never again in serious doubt that there would be one, a peacetime establishment. Whether it was big or small or what its mandate was supposed to be, those things changed. It was always going to involve volunteers and call-ups and so forth, but there was going to be a professional army even in peacetime. That's kind of what that Army bill accomplished. If that Army bill hadn't happened, if and how that would have gone, I kind of boggles the mind. But it's an interesting question.
Well, maybe the line would have continued to be the Ohio River or whatever.
That line would have held for a while, because they weren't going to give it up unless they were conquered,
So the Brits would have more incentive to fight harder on 1812, right?
Yeah, that's true, and they were trying to do the same thing in 1812 that they had sort of tried to do in the time I'm writing about, which is create a kind of proxy war, use the native allies, and what they were hoping for was to get back a nice slice of the upper Midwest that they could use as a buffer zone. But actually, to this point, I'll just finish up this one thought, because this makes me think of something else. This is where Tecumseh comes in, of course, is in the War of 1812 and so forth. I will always, having done this work on this book, see Tecumseh and the War of 1812 as a weak echo of the story I'm telling here. This is turning the telescope around, because we think Revolution, War of 1812. This is the thing. This story to me disrupts that, and the War of 1812 and the Tecumseh piece of it in particular feels to me like kind of a sad attempt to revive something that came to an end, really, here.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So I wonder if you could say a little more about just what are the sources from which you really know a lot about Little Turtle and Blue Jacket?
The sources on those guys, the record on indigenous people, especially at this time in the 18th century, is weak, is sparse. A lot of records, they did keep records. They kept them in the form of, wampum belts and so forth that were quite complicated. And a lot of that stuff got destroyed, like actually during some of this fighting, because you would burn villages and all that stuff would just burn up. So the current record is weak, and you're relying largely on official American papers. Because you have there are these meetings and these treaty meetings, and they go on these meetings, by the way, go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. So there's a huge amount of record. The Six Nations of the Iroquois come to Philadelphia when it was the capital, not here, and they go on for weeks and weeks having meetings and speeches and gifts and parties, and it's a whole entertainment. It's a whole deal. And so there's voluminous stuff on that in the American state papers, for one thing, and in the writings of the famous founders as they're collected and edited. But you are relying, to an unfortunate degree, on this filter that gets in your way as a writer, a historian, whatever, trying to figure out what really happened, because you're dependent on this biased partial record, including translation, of course, So you just wonder sometimes what really happened. On the other hand, if you're trying to write a narrative book that's gripping, you can't constantly be saying, who knows, something happened, I don't know what it is. So you have to take some shots, you've got to take some risks. And then there are notes, you put in your notes what you can about the record. For those who are interested in the record, who are reading this book, you won't find me doing too much of that in the text, but the notes do get into some pretty significant detail about what we can and can't say, and what's a speculation, and so forth. Yes.
Yes, I understand. Around that time, there was an American, I don't know if he was back in the Army, a general named Wilkinson, who was later found to be a traitor.
He's in here.
Did he have any involvement in that directly at all?
Absolutely, yeah. Wilkinson is an amazing character. He's with Wayne on the march that's ultimately successful. He was Wayne's second in command. And James Wilkinson, who was a well-liked officer, and had done well in the Revolution, and the men liked him. Some of them liked him a lot more than Wayne. He was a spy for Spain. He had a double life, a total double life. He was second in command in the U.S. Army and a spy for Spain. A Spanish, he had officially, secretly, in New Orleans, given up his U.S. citizenship and signed documents making himself subject to the King of Spain. And yet he was second in command in the Army. And he spent his entire time on the march with Wayne undermining everything Wayne did. I mean, he kept writing back to Knox in Philadelphia directly, over Wayne's head, like, this is the most incompetent, drunk, some point he says something like, this is the most incompetent general in the history of, war. While Wayne is actually just really, Wayne could be, he took risks like every other officer in general, but sometimes other people were concerned about his judgment. But, Wilkinson spent his entire time just trying to cut Wayne down. After the story's over, I don't get into it too much here, but Wilkinson, after Wayne dies, and the whole area's been pacified, and they have the new treaties, and the Indians have been removed, and blah, 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 Wilkinson becomes the commander of the U.S. forces after Wayne dies. And he had that job for years and years and years while still serving as a Spanish spy. And later, long after this, not that long, but it's outside my frame here, he gets involved with Burr on that whole expedition to go to get into Mexico and do whatever that was that Burr was trying to do. Then he undermined Burr. Actually, I think Burr was prosecuted because Wilkinson gave him up. So Wilkinson was quite a guy. I'm glad you brought him up.
On that note, we are out of time, so thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Politics and Prose for having me. It's so great. I've never been here before. I know all about it, but it's just so great to be at this great institution of the book at last. So thanks a lot.